Welcome, everyone. The presentation is about to begin. Just a note that this session will be recorded and will last 60 minutes. Please keep your microphones muted during the presentation and turn off your web cameras. If you have a question or a comment, enter it in the chat during the presentation, and the presenter will address your questions at the end. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 1 week after this live event. So TESOL International Association's Intercultural Communication Interest section is pleased to present the webinar titled Dwelling in the Third Space, Indigenous Maya and Kichwa Students in US K-12 and Higher Education Classrooms. Our speaker is Luis Javier Penton Herrera. We're very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar. My name is Natalia Boryasnikova, and I'm the co-chair of the Intercultural Communication Interest section, and I will be a moderator for today's event. So if we could advance the slide, please. Before we begin, just to let you know what is Intercultural Communication Interest section. We address the ever-growing needs of language teachers who must engage in intercultural communication, even when they're teaching in their home countries. In addition to doing our work during the convention, we facilitate practice-focused webinars, informal coffee hours, academic panels, Pecha Kucha enlightening talks, regular newsletter issues, and more to keep you, our membership, engaged in this work. Next slide, please. If you would like to become a member of our Intercultural Communication Interest section, the first step is to become a member of TESOL International. When you're a member of TESOL International, you will have access to my TESOL portal, where you can join our Intercultural Communication Interest section. However, you can also follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we have regular events. So we have a webinar today. In August, we have a fantastic coffee hour, which is an informal way to get to meet other members of the interest section. Further, in September, we'll have lightning talks focusing on doctoral students' works in progress. In October, we have a webinar that will be focusing on multiliteracies and multimodalities. In November, we'll have another webinar focusing on phonology and non-native English-speaking teacher cognitions. These two will be webinars facilitated by TESOL. In December, we have another fantastic interactive coffee hours focusing on different practical activities for the classroom. And next year in January, we have stories from the classroom presented through in the format of lightning talks. So please stay tuned, and thank you again for joining us today. Next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer LaCroix. I am the co-chair of the Intercultural Communication Interest section, ICIS. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today with Dr. Luis Javier Penton Herrera. Dr. Penton Herrera served as the 38th president of Maryland TESOL in 2018 through 19. He currently serves as dissertation core faculty in the Department of Educational Leadership and Administration at the American College of Education and as a professional lecturer of TESOL at the George Washington University. In addition, he serves as the Social Responsibility Interest Section co-chair at TESOL International Association. He is the co-editor of Critical Storytelling, Multilingual Immigrants in the United States, co-author of Social Emotional Learning in the English Language Classroom, Fostering Growth, Self-Care, and Independence, and co-author of the Maryland TESOL Handbook for Educators of English Learners. Luis, it is my pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Natalia and Jennifer, for the opportunity to really talk a little bit about my students today. And thank you again for the invitation. Thank you everyone for joining me today. And today, as we shared earlier, my presentation will be dwelling in the third space, Indigenous Maya and Kichwa students in US K through 12 and higher education classrooms. And in my presentation, what I would really be talking about, it's going to be more of a conversation, you know, if we can think about it this way. I'll be sharing a little bit of information about my students and the lessons I learned from them when I was teaching them in K through 12 and in higher education. And I was truly privileged to work with Indigenous migrant students. And I'll be using that term in our presentation instead of using Indigenous students from Latin America or Indigenous Latinx students, because there is let's just say a current struggle there with the right term. So I'm going to be using Indigenous migrant students. So I hope that's okay. And then more specifically, I'll be talking about the Maya and Kichwa students in K through 12 and higher education. So the agenda for today, first, I'll set the foundation, a little bit of information about Indigenous students from Latin America. Then I'll be talking about the Maya and the Kichwa, because those are the student populations that I'll be sharing information with you, and I'll be talking about them today. So I'll share a little bit of information before we get started. And then also I'll be going over the theoretical underpinnings, the third space. And then in part two is the part where I'll be sharing 3 themes or 3 salient lessons learned that I learned from my students, which is language and identity, feelings of belonging, and negotiations in language learning. And then I will end with a final thoughts, and then we'll go into question and answers. So I do want to leave 10 to 15 minutes of question and answers. So I know, you know, after 1 hour, we're disconnected. So I want to make sure that by 12:45 we get there. And before we get started, I want to very quickly just do a quick poll with all of you. And if you can just type it in your chat box, please. Have you taught and or supported Indigenous students from Latin America before? And then if you write yes, please can you tell me the setting? This is just kind of informal data collection here for my purposes only. Yes. Oh, Bridget, great to see you here. Yes, 9 to 12. High school, no, I don't think so. That's a great comment there. I don't think so. Good. We're gonna talk about that. 9 to 12, so definitely high school seems to be the, those of us who say yes, high school seems to be the higher population. Thank you all for your responses here. And in my experience, Indigenous students, 3rd grade, elementary, yes. So high school tends to be the higher population. Presently is going to change, of course. Demographics will continue to change, and then elementary schools will become the more prevalent. But right now, in my experience, is high school. Thank you all so much for sharing that information. Well, let's talk a little bit about setting the foundation for you know, information about Indigenous students. And as you will see, it's very important for us to be aware of Indigenous populations, because not all students coming from Latin American countries identify as Latino, Latina, Latinx. And as I shared earlier, even identifying them with that label term might be offensive to them. So my first experience with Indigenous students from Latin America was around the school year 2014, 2015, when I moved to Maryland, and I was teaching high school at the time. And I was teaching newcomers to what I thought was a class full of Hispanic, Spanish-speaking students from Latin America. And, you know, I was raised and born and raised in Cuba. So in Cuba, the education system is very Eurocentric in the sense that everything is about Christopher Columbus, and it came to the Americas, and Indigenous people were killed, and that's it. Every time they keep talking about in education in Cuba, every time they talked about it, Indigenous people was in the past tense, and that they no longer exist. So, you know, me coming to the US and becoming a teacher, I had that information in my head, and that was all I knew. But when I was teaching at that high school in 2014, 2015, my first year, I remember I often used Spanish to help my students when they were learning the information. Again, it was a class full of Spanish speakers in my view, because they were all from El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras. Those were the 3 countries that were represented in my school, in my classroom. So I was teaching them, and I would usually use Spanish for verb conjugations and other things to explain those difficult concepts for, you know, especially for newcomers. And then I always had this student that I called Diego. And then one time I was teaching and explaining in Spanish the present progressive ing, which is very easy to understand in Spanish if you're a Spanish speaker. But Diego continued to struggle with that information. And then I was beginning to doubt my abilities as a teacher, you know, because if you're using all the resources that you have available in your view, right? And I'm like, how am I not able to share this knowledge, and how am I not explaining this well enough for all my students? So I put an activity on the board, and I'm like, everybody just focus on this activity. Let's do this activity now. And then I sat with Diego, and then I asked him, Diego, what's happening? Why am I not doing right here? You know, when I'm explaining, what am I not doing that is not helping you? I don't know what's happening, that you're not getting this information. And I explained it in Spanish and English, what's happening. And then he confessed to me that he was learning Spanish as a second language. And then he was learning English as a third language simultaneously. So I'm like, Diego, what do you mean? And then he told me he spoke Ichil as a first language. Ichil is a Mayan language from Guatemala specifically. And I kept asking him, aren't you from Guatemala? Aren't you Latino? It's like, mister, I speak Ichil as a first language, Spanish and English I'm learning as a second and third language. I just didn't understand what was happening. But that was, that really shook my world, right? Because I did not know to that point that Indigenous people were alive, very much so. And then that some of my students were actually Indigenous students from Latin America, and they did not speak Spanish as a first language. So that really just changed my entire worldview about what I thought I knew as a person, as a teacher. It was transforming for me. So if you haven't had the opportunity to teach Indigenous students, I want to share with you that Indigenous students and really Indigenous people from Latin America have endured and continue to be faced with practices of erasure, standardization, and pastness. And what I mean by this is that in the stories, in the history books, many times, in the same way that it happened to me in my education in Cuba, Indigenous people continue to be portrayed as people from the past. Indigenous people they always use past tense, and they always are erased from society today, when in fact, in Latin America, there is an estimated 826 Indigenous languages and communities living in Central and South, North, if we include Mexico, Central and South America. And let me tell you, the Caribbean islands, many people think that Indigenous people were killed by Spaniards, by colonizers when they arrived. But in fact, there is an Indigenous movement right now, an Indigenous movement in Latin America, in the Caribbean islands, specifically Puerto Rico, Cuba, Jamaica, of Indigenous Taino people. The Taino were the most prevalent Indigenous populations over there, that they're reclaiming their ethnicity, their race, their language, their culture. And many of us are finding through our DNAs now that we do have Indigenous DNA with us. And we saw this in our families. Like I would always see my mom's side of the family, they didn't look white, and I didn't understand why. And, I recently took a DNA test and I found out why. But all of these things, this history of erasure and pastness has continued to become part of what is our history. But in fact, Indigenous cultures, languages, societies, communities are very much alive. So there is an estimated 45 million Indigenous people living in what is known today as Mexico, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. And I think the number is going to get bigger with the Caribbean now going through this movement of Indigenous awakening. So the Mayas, brief overview, as I said, about the Mayas, they do have a rich history of over 3,000 years. Some historians might say close to 4,000 years before colonizers arrived in the Americas. The Maya Empire, you can see it here in the picture that I added here, extended from the Mexican states of Yucatan, Tabasco, Campeche, Chiapas, to Belize, what is known today as Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, and the western region of Honduras. You can see it there by Copan. So all of the red tracing there, that's what the Mayan Empire looked like before. The Maya had an advanced knowledge and development in reading, writing, math, science, architecture, engineering. Those just are to name a few. And they had very sophisticated knowledge of agriculture. But as we know, when Spanish colonizers arrived, then the Mayan kingdom was defeated. And then, since that time, the Mayan people have continued to experience this cycle of genocide, dehumanization, subjugation, marginalization, imposed and systematically enforced poverty, and dispossession of lands and livelihood. And there was a recent event, and this is something that marked a lot of the present day Mayan communities, and my students used to talk to me about this. There was a recent genocide recorded against Guatemalan people, specifically Guatemalan indigenous people, that occurred during the 1960 to 1996 under the dictator Efraín Ríos Montt. And there were a monthly average of 3,000 to 3,500 indigenous people being killed during this time. And this resulted in an estimated 200,000 people being killed during these 36 years, and over 1 million, or 10% of the Guatemalan population at that time, being displaced. And I shared this with you because although this happened in 1960 to 1996, this is one of the reasons why indigenous populations, specifically from Guatemala, have been moving to the US, one of the reasons why. And they've been migrating to the US for, I was reading recently in a book, this is like the fourth wave of migration since the 1900s. And it's because of things like this, because of genocide, because of continued and systematic imposed poverty and difficult challenges that they go through. And today, the Mayan people reside primarily in Guatemala. That's the biggest Mayan country in Central America. Mexico, Belize, and the US. And in Guatemala alone, there are over 22 Mayan languages being spoken. So think about that. It's truly wonderful, very diverse community. And then the Kichwa, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about Kichwas from Saraguro specifically, which is where my student was from. And the Kichwa from Saraguro are one of the Andean indigenous communities that have truly regained control of their lands. They have retained, control of their lands more successfully. So they do, it's a little bit different for them because the majority do receive quality bilingual education since early childhood, and then they do speak Spanish and Kichwa fluently. Most of Kichwas from Saraguro have a strong formal education background that is bilingual. They do have, however, some challenges. They are still fighting for food security over there, decolonization, water protection, and they're always fighting the pollution of contamination from mining and other practices that are affecting their communities, like many indigenous communities are fighting throughout Latin America, and I would say, around the world, most of them. And in many cases, this information is important because in many cases, our indigenous migrant students arrive with trauma resulting from all of these experiences. And as Dr. Luis Urrieta shares in one of his publications, indigenous people from Latin America are survivors of the nexus of bio, psycho, social, cultural, spiritual, intergenerational trauma. These traumas are the results of hundreds of years of colonialisms and enduring power structures that have impacted and continue to affect the lives of native pueblos, peoples, and communities. So this is important to know because it affects our students in their native countries, in the countries of origins, but also when they arrive in our classrooms. And now I need to make very, very clear that the information that I'm sharing with you here, my goal is not to victimize indigenous students or indigenous populations from Latin America. That's not my purpose. My purpose with sharing this information with you is to provide a clear, a factual, historical background. I want us to know the reality of our indigenous students in their countries of origin, and why, really why these life experiences are very different from non-indigenous communities or non-indigenous students who are coming to the US from Latin American countries. So I hope this background information will give you that perspective of how different indigenous students' lives are from non-indigenous students. Okay, these different experiences definitely affect their way of seeing the world, their attitudes, their opportunities to formal education in their countries of origin, which is very important. And also, you may notice if you have taught Indigenous students like I did, that many of them are always very hyper alert, or they're in a fight and flight mode in our classrooms. And this, of course, is trauma, being written in their bodies, how they react to things, to sounds. Whereas non-Indigenous students from Latin America, for example, after the initial period of shock, they're more relaxed, they feel at ease. In my experience, Indigenous students have a more difficult time transitioning because of those experiences. Okay, so the theoretical underpinning, as I said, I'll be talking here a little bit about the third space, and I'm using this third space, this idea, this concept of third space. I use it to explain the experiences of Indigenous students from Latin America. For example, for students who are non-Indigenous and they're from Latin America, they may easily identify the language that they speak with their country of origin. This is always not the case for Indigenous people. We have to remember that in many cases, what we know today as countries or political borders were forced upon Indigenous people. And also Indigenous people were removed from their lands. So this means that, for example, some Indigenous communities like Mayas from Guatemala, they don't necessarily speak the language that is perceived or seen or identified as the language of Guatemala, which is Spanish. So these are things that we have to be aware of. I added a link back down there, breaking, let me see here, because I have the chat box here. Breaking the Bonds of People and Land, so by Dr. Claudia Jaca, where you'll be able to, you can click on it. I'll share the PowerPoint with you, but then you can learn a little bit more about Native American removal in the US and in Mexico. And hopefully that will give you a little bit more information about how Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students have different experiences, and how geographic location and race, those are usually not standard for Indigenous communities, and they're always in between, and this hybrid space, that's where they dwell. Okay, so that will be our theoretical underpinnings, and this idea of third space, how Indigenous students, and this is the lens that I'll be using, how Indigenous students dwell in a space that is different from their non-Indigenous counterparts. All right, so here we're going to be talking a little bit about lessons learned, and then I'll be sharing information about language and identity, feelings of belonging, and negotiation in language learning. So the first point here, language and identity. So I'll divide this lesson learned into three takeaways. So the first one, students' perception of their language directly affected or affects their self-perception and self-worth, self-value. Students who believe their Indigenous languages were intrinsic parts of their culture, meaning they're connected, were proud to express their Indigenous identity in our classes, use their Indigenous languages, and ask for resources in their Indigenous languages. And I'll talk more about these 3 points. And the last point, in that students who arrive with adverse experiences, such as a history of discrimination, trauma, they did not want to identify as Indigenous for fear of being denigrated, disrespected, or harmed, which is what they experienced in their countries of origin. So the first point here, students' perception of their language directly affected their self-perception and self-worth. And, when I was teaching my Indigenous students, the first couple of years, I received students who, most of them were Chil speakers, and I did have also Cachiquel speakers. Those are Mayan languages and communities. And in my experience, they did not want to be associated with the language, with the culture of Ichil, Maya, Cachiquel. They did not want to be associated with that. And they tried very, very, very hard to just only speak Spanish or Spanish and English, but not speak the language that it was their native language, their Indigenous language. And I remember, me, a new teacher, trying to understand how to support them. I was becoming very aware that using Spanish to teach them English was not helpful to them, to some of them. And then one time I talked to one of my students, Pedro, and I was telling him, Pedro, can you tell me what you need from me? You know, I have these resources in Spanish, but I want to share these resources in Ichil. Where can I look for information? What do you need? How can I help you? And then he shared this with me that is very deep, but I didn't understand that at the time. And he said, I do not want to be chill, Mr. Penton, because I want to be a doctor. I didn't understand what he meant by that at that time. That was 2014, 2015. And, you know, the more I continued to learn with him and from other of my Indigenous students, it became apparent that there was this linguistic hierarchy that some of my Indigenous students developed, you know, in their brains, in their minds, of how they saw their Indigenous languages and their Indigenous cultures as being kind of on the last step of the ladder. And it was connected to denigration because they continuously used their language, let's just say back in their country of origin in Guatemala, for Pedro's purposes, being Maya. Every time he used his language, then, you know, Ichil language, back in Guatemala, Spanish speakers will make fun of him and would call him pejorative terms and things like this. He also shared with me once that his mom couldn't speak Spanish. So back home, Spanish speakers will always call her names and, you know, less educated and like she was not intelligent because she was not able to speak Spanish. It sounds familiar here in the US when people don't speak English, you know, oh, you don't speak English, you're not intelligent, things like that. It sounds familiar. It happens in their countries of origin, but with Spanish. So quickly, the Indigenous languages in their brains, there was this hierarchy where their Indigenous languages was kind of like the thing to avoid, because then that would result in, if you engage in using those words, that language, and you become associated with that vocabulary, that language, then you will be, you know, there will be discrimination, denigration, all of these things. And then Spanish was the language of power. However, when they came to the United States, that shifted because then most of them were in a Latino Spanish-speaking community, a prevalent Spanish-speaking community. So they were part of that Spanish-speaking community. And then they used Spanish for communication, but many of them were learning Spanish simultaneously when they were learning English. So it was very interesting. But they focus on using Spanish with their Spanish speakers, classmates, colleagues, neighbors, because again, if they use their Indigenous language, it will be that same racist practices that happen back home or in their countries of origin, it would happen again here with the Spanish speakers. And then English became the language of success. So it was interesting to see how the language that they used for them became associated with their person, their identity, how they saw themselves. If I use it chill, I will be discriminated against. I have less worth. But if I use English, that's the language of success, I'm going to be looked at like I'm more intelligent, more this, more that. So they had this hierarchy in their brains, and this I learned from them how they saw language. And it was interesting to see one time I had many, of course, as I was teaching them, I observed many incidents with language in our classes. I remember one time in the 2014-15 class school year when I had Chill students there. And then one of the Chill students couldn't speak Spanish very well. And they would often go to Pedro. Pedro was kind of very smart and he was always finishing things. He really wanted to move forward and be successful. That's what was his main thing, being successful. And one time I saw this Chill student come to him and ask him questions because, you know, he was always finishing first and he had you know, the correct answers always for the activities. And then the Chill student talked to Pedro in Ichil, but Pedro responded back in Spanish. He didn't want to use Ichil. And then I do remember, because Pedro was learning Spanish as a second language, so sometimes he would make some verb conjugations that were not correct, and Spanish speakers would laugh at him. And, you know, but it was interesting to see when Spanish speakers would ask him questions, Pedro would not speak in Spanish, he would speak in English to show that he could speak English. And so it was this hierarchy of languages that was truly fascinating to see how students like Pedro saw languages, if you're going to talk to me in Chile, I'm going to talk to you in a language that I think is more powerful. And then if you're going to talk to me in Spanish, I'm going to talk to you in English. Some of the Spanish speakers actually got upset with Pedro many times because Pedro wouldn't talk to them in Spanish, he would talk to them in English. So talk about, language of power or linguistic hierarchy. It was interesting to see that, but definitely language and identity were very much connected. The second point, and I'm looking at the time because I don't want to, it's already 30. So let me go back, let me continue to make these points, and I'll promise I'll be a little bit faster here. So students who believe their indigenous languages were intrinsic part of their culture were proud to express their indigenous identity in our classes. In this point, above all, I did see, I did have indigenous students who did not want to be associated with their indigenous languages and cultures, but I did have, and it was very refreshing to see indigenous students who were very, very proud of their indigenous languages, communities, culture. And the more proud they were, the more they requested and they wanted support in their indigenous languages, not in Spanish. And I did find there was a direct correlation between students who had age-appropriate literacy, that were bilingual, multilingual in their indigenous languages in Spanish, and feeling proud. So let me explain this. For my students who were, for example, they arrived as bilingual or multilingual in indigenous languages in Spanish, and then they were learning English as a new language, those students often felt more empowered to ask for resources in their indigenous languages and make sure that everybody knew, I am Mam, I am Ichil, I am Cachiquel, I am Quechí, I am indigenous from this country. Yo soy Mam de Guatemala, I am Mam from Guatemala. They would usually introduce themselves like that. And that was very interesting to see because they wanted to make sure that everybody knew, that all teachers knew that they were Mam, they were indigenous first, they were Mayan first, and then Guatemalan second. And they would request support in their indigenous languages. And I had students, wonderful, and they would tell me, I had students who spoke 2 languages, 3 languages even before they were learning English. I had a student who was born and raised for some part of his life in the Ichil community, so he spoke Ichil. Then he moved during his teenage years to a region where they spoke Cachiquel, so he spoke Cachiquel as a second language. He spoke Spanish as a third language, and he was learning English as a fourth language. And then he would tell me often, Mister, I know 3 languages. I'm not like my other classmates that they only speak Spanish and they make fun of my Spanish. I speak 3 languages. I'm learning English as a fourth language. And I'm like, yes, you're multilingual and you're wonderful. So they had this sense of empowerment that I love to see. And I always let everybody know, the more languages you speak, the more powerful you are. Imagine how many people you can connect with. So it was very interesting to see that. Unfortunately, in our school district and in many school districts in the United States, we do not have resources in indigenous languages. So that was something that it was kind of a homework assignment for me as their teacher to find some resources in indigenous languages. And all of you, if you're interested in some resources, email me after the presentation. I'll be glad to share some resources with you in indigenous languages. Let me continue here for time's sakes, because I do want 15 minutes of us question and answers. So as you can see here, I very rarely use English only policies in my classroom, especially in newcomer classrooms. I wanted them to use their languages in English and learn. Let's learn together. So my students would often use their indigenous languages. On the bottom here, I have a report that we were writing in their indigenous languages first, and then in English, and then that's Mam on the top left-hand side, that's Quechí, that's Mam on the right-hand side. And then I want to share with you, for my newcomers, I did a lot of poetry and poems, and I just love poetry, and newcomer classroom is, I feel, in my personal experience, is the best way to promote innovation and playing with the words and language. And I would often ask my students to write their poems in their native languages and in English, right? And my student, Mam student, he wrote this poem in Mam, which is translated to my very beautiful mother. And he, I want to share with you, he allowed me to use this for our presentation and his recording. And if you have never heard an indigenous language, an indigenous Mayan language, I want you to hear, please, his poem. It will be 30, 40 seconds.
Ish ang nani nsach triong mbeiwen tu mi chinka toch be anyawen.
Wonderful. As you can see here, this is not Spanish. This is a Mayan language, and they're very different from one another. So it's not, when we think about, oh, they speak indigenous languages, you know, they speak indigenous languages, might be very similar to Spanish because of where they live. No, it's very different. So it's just wonderful. Okay, so let me continue here because we're getting, oh, sorry, let me go back here. Okay, here we go. And the last part here, students who arrived with adverse experiences, a history of discrimination, like the student I was mentioning to you, Pedro, he had a very traumatic life back home in his country of origin. And trauma, they did not want to identify themselves as indigenous for fear of being denigrated, disrespected, or harmed. And that's something that I often saw in some of my students, that they did not want to be identified as indigenous. And this is not because they wanted to lie to anyone. It was a protective, a survival skill that they learned from the countries of origin, that if you identify, or if you're known as indigenous, then automatically and when I say they, Spanish speakers usually, and people who are not indigenous in their countries of origins, they begin to disrespect them, to harm them. I belong to different groups, indigenous groups from Latin America, in social media as well. I follow different groups, and it seems really like every month there are people getting killed, elders, activists, indigenous activists getting killed because they're indigenous and because they're fighting to keep their lands. And these are the things that our children, that our students are seeing. And being indigenous usually means being harmed and being disrespected. So many of my students who do not want to identify as indigenous is because they have experienced this history of discrimination, trauma firsthand. And that's why you can see their trauma is visible in their body and how they react, in how many of them perhaps don't want to make relationships or do not want to establish relationships with Spanish speakers in the classroom. This might be the reason why. Also, in my view, and this is something that I had to learn because I did not know this, my Spanish speakers will use phrases and terms like "que indio eres," you're such an Indian. And I didn't know what that meant in Spanish. "Que indio eres," you're such an Indian. Think about that. But then, one day I asked one of my students, what does that mean when someone calls you Indian or Indio? And it was, it was associated with being uneducated, with being the worst of the worst. If someone called you Indian, it means that they think the worst of you. So imagine these things being told to students, and they have to deal with this. And that happens in our English classrooms as well, because we might be unaware of this. And Spanish speakers, they replicate these racist behaviors from back home. I'm not going to say everyone, I'm just saying it might happen from Spanish speakers to indigenous students. Okay, so definitely language, and if Spanish speakers identify that some students are indigenous or they speak indigenous languages, this will affect them as well. Okay, and then some examples here that I want to share with you. Okay, I only have 5 minutes left, so very quickly, the one on the right. So the one on the right, is especially for students with limited or interrupted formal education. It was very difficult for me in the beginning to help them with print literacy, because many of them, because of imposed poverty and all the challenges that they had back in their country of origin, many of them did not have access to quality education. Of course, it was not their fault. It was institutional challenges that they didn't give them formal education or access to formal education, or the quality was not good. And then, how can I teach them print? How can I teach them English? How can I use their background knowledge, information? So that was something that I struggled with often. And then I found that arts and arts-based activities for newcomers who have interrupted education and are Indigenous migrant students, that seemed to be very, very helpful for them. And I found that the work produced by my Indigenous migrant students through arts-based activities, that really expanded also my definition of literacy and what literacy is, because I began to notice and to learn details that I did not understand, because, you know, I was trained in a different way of looking at literacy through production and reading and writing, but it's beyond that. You know, in the right-hand side here, we see elements of Mayan literacy. For example, my student, he used colors and patterns and to assign symbols to the woman's traditional regalia, and, you know, specific patterns and colors meant that she belonged to a different, to a specific Mayan community. So these are literacies. This is knowledge that they have that I didn't know, that I didn't understand. Okay, so these are things how the reality is that Indigenous literacies, epistemologies, they're often, you know, the way of thinking, knowing, they're often ignore or not consider literacy in traditional Western schooling, which is, this causes really detrimental effects to Indigenous students and knowledge systems. But, you know, this is something that I definitely, as a teacher, I can tell you that I learned from my students, is to look at literacy in a different light. And I'll be glad to talk more in the question and answer about this, but I do want to continue because I only have 5 minutes. 4, feelings of belonging. I'm just going to talk a little bit very quickly about Carmen. She's my student from the university, and she's Kichwa. And I was talking to Carmen, and I told her, Carmen, how do you feel in that university that we were teaching? Is a bilingual university. It's mostly, you know, 90-something% is Latinx higher education students. 1 week they teach in English and Spanish. It used to be Ana G. Mendez in Maryland. It's now closed, but she used to be part of Ana G. Mendez. She was studying economics. And I asked her, Carmen, how do you feel with, you know, this community here of Latino students? And you sometimes come dress up in your regalia. How do you feel? Do you feel like you belong? How do they see you? Can you tell me a little bit about this? And she shared with me, when I dress in my regalia and go out, including the university, I feel good. Although sometimes they, and she was talking about her classmates, they look at me as a strange creature. I feel good, and wherever I go, I can identify myself as Kichwa. So she was talking to me about how other students perceive her and how she sees herself. And she was very proud of in her Kichwa identity and the fact that she was trilingual, Kichwa, Spanish, and English. And but she did talk to me a little bit more about how her classmates, her Latino classmates, when she would come dressed in her Kichwa regalia, they would look at her and treat her differently. So if she claimed her identity, her Indigenous identity as Kichwa by dressing, by using her language, then she knew that that would come at the expense of not belonging to the Latino group anymore, because they would look at her differently. And that certainly happened with Mayan students as well in K through 12. Whereas if she dressed up like, you know, not Indigenous, and she wouldn't talk about her Kichwa, Indigenous, the belonging at the Kichwa from Saraguro Indigenous communities, or in speaking Kichwa, then she will feel like she belonged more in the Latino group, because they will accept her more and they will treat her like, you know, one of the Spanish speakers. So it was interesting to see how if students claim and make visible their Indigenous culture, their Indigenous languages, in this space of Latino space, then it's like almost like they have to make a negotiation of, do I want to belong and hide my identity and language, or do I want to share my identity and languages in this space of Latinos and not feeling welcome or even not belonging? And talking a little bit about negotiations, this is going to be the last point I make very quickly, and then I'm going to open to questions and answers. So negotiations, two important things that I learned, and you can read this, I'll share the PowerPoint with all of you. The first point is that in my mind, I was always trained to give students, you know, this idea of teaching with student-centered practices and giving them that independence. However, for my Indigenous students, specifically students with limited or interrupted formal education, or even those who have formal education, back in their countries of origin in Latin America, most of the instruction is teacher-led instruction. So they had to make that negotiation in our language classrooms, because my teaching approach was initially more student-centered, and I would tell them, okay, so now you have to do this, come on, let's work together, and you do it. And groups, they didn't like that. They prefer to study by themselves, learn by themselves, and then more structure, teacher-led teacher-led environment. That's what they preferred. And that was something that they always had to negotiate, because that was not my teaching style initially. So I had to modify it, and they had to also negotiate their preferences with my teaching style, which was creating tensions for them. Also, one final, I cannot believe that time is just flying by, I'm so sorry. So also another negotiation that they had to make is that because we did not have indigenous, information in indigenous languages, we did not have resources, dictionaries and things like this in indigenous languages, they had to use the resources in Spanish instead of their indigenous languages. And they often would tell me, Mr. Penton, why, if you're using their languages, you're using French, you're using Spanish, you're using Arabic, why can you use resources in my language? Why? I didn't have an answer for that. So I became more proactive in finding resources by myself, because my school district didn't support me with that. And then it's 46. Let me keep going. I'll be sharing with you this. You can read a little bit about Carmen, but in essence, she had to make this negotiation of how she saw Spanish and English as more important for her children than learning Kichwa, which was very concerning for me about, because if indigenous communities start supporting this idea of losing their indigenous languages, that's going to be very saddening for indigenous language preservations. Okay. So I'm going to finish with these final thoughts here, and then we're going to do question and answers. So I would like to end this presentation by first honoring the languages and cultures of my Mayan and Kichwa students, and by recognizing that the number of studies and scholarly contributions about indigenous migrant students in the US remains insufficient. I hope the stories and just very brief overview I shared with all of you today were helpful, and that in some way it will contribute towards making indigenous migrant students and their experiences more visible in the United States and in education. And there are many resources, like I said, I'll be glad to share more resources with you, but please note that indigenous languages have a written system, many of them, and there are academies in their countries of origin with the purpose of promoting and making their indigenous languages and preserving their scholarly writing. So these are some of them, but I'll be glad to share more resources with all of you. So just email me. Thank you all for your time. Time just flew by. So I'll be glad to share more of my work with all of you here. Again, you can click to all of these links. There is another one that is coming out soon in the Journal of Language, Identity and Education that as soon as comes out, I'll be glad to share with all of you as well. So you'll have access to all of this PDFs in the PowerPoint and my references. And now we go to the questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Luis. This was very informative. I wish we had more time. I'm sure we could continue to talk about this for a very long time. And I'm sure our participants have some questions. No doubt I already took lots of notes. I feel like I learned a lot from you. So thank you so much for being so informative. This was really great. And I'm going to turn it over to our participants now. If you have a question or comment, please post it in the chat box. I will read it out loud for the recording, and then Luis will answer. Also, feel free to unmute yourselves if you prefer to ask your question orally. So I hand it over to our participants, and I'm going through. And the first comment, Luis, comes from Stella Dubish. I would like to hear you talk more about literacy. Thank you, Stella. Luis, comments?
Yes, Stella, can you please share a little bit more about specifically about what information would you like to for me to share about more about literacy, or Indigenous literacy? Can you share more details, please?
Well, I have to apologize. I had to step out. Some students came to visit me. And so I might have missed a couple things, but I did hear you say that your thoughts about literacy had changed in working with some of your students. And I wanted to know, like, in what way, or what were you noticing? Many of other students here in our school do have very low levels of literacy in English, and then we're able to assess them in Spanish, sometimes low levels there as well. And you've really illuminated some reasons why that might be the case. But I just wanted to hear you say more about that. And I apologize if you said something that I missed.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for that question. Wonderful. So, you know, in my experience, and I continue, this is something that I continue to go through and learn more about. So I initially only thought of literacy as being able to read and write fluently, and being able to, even when you're learning a language, you have to speak perfectly, and you have to, you know, this idea of comparing always with native speakers, and how native Spanish speakers conjugate verbs, or the vocabulary that they use, same with English speakers. And I always held my students to that standard. Same with reading and writing. And that's all I thought about literacy. And then, you know, things that my students come with, I was talking about the indigenous way of looking at Mayan literacy, how they understand the color patterns, and assigning, you know, for the regalia. If you have this color pattern and these colors and the patterns, they identify that right away with a particular Mayan community, and they bring many more skills like weaving and things like that. I'll be glad to share that. There's an article coming out soon, a chapter coming out soon, that I'll be glad to share more details as soon as it comes out about that as well. But you know, I don't think right away anymore as, okay, my students cannot read and write, they're deficient in literacy. I don't think about it that way anymore. I think about it as, okay, so this is something that they need, obviously, for our schools. I'm not oblivious. In schools, we continue to do standardized training, which I think is not good for all students, because reading and writing, okay, that's only part of the knowledge that you need. But what else do you need to succeed in life? So now I'm looking at literacy for ideas and things that they need, skills that they need beyond school. Once they finish high school, what else do they need? And many of my students had great skills at math that was not traditional math, but math for, you know, doing transactions and things like that, because that's what they did back home. Things that agriculture, nature, things that I didn't know. And are they going to be able to use it here? Maybe not. I don't know. But those skills they bring it. So it's not that we should just avoid those skills and just focus on reading and writing. What are they going to need in their future? That's what I focused on the most during my last year of teaching them, and just going beyond the reading and writing. Yes, reading and writing is important for K through 12, but going beyond that.
Great, thank you for that. And also you have many other questions now. So we have about 7 minutes, and we'll try to get 1 minute for each answer. Have you noticed in some of your students a change of attitude for their native languages, and were they aware of what caused it? So a change in attitude towards their native language.
That's a great question. I have to say that it really, you know, my students, to a certain, perhaps they don't understand that their perception of language and their identity, for example, if they think of their identity and their language as being less than or more than, they don't see it perhaps, or they don't understand it as being part of the broader conversation, social, political, but definitely it comes down to their experiences. In my experience with my students, those students who experience more trauma, more difficulties, more imposed poverty and harm, those were the ones who wanted to not be identified as Indigenous, or they did not want to perhaps use their Indigenous languages for fear of prosecution or harm. But then those students who grew up in communities that had a very strong sense of Indigenous identity, of language use every day, and strong print literacy and reading and writing in those Indigenous languages, they saw language as part of their culture. And one of my students once told me, you know, if I stop speaking my language, then my culture dies. So they saw language and culture as being connected. It was very interesting to see that. I don't know if I answered that question, but I'm trying to answer as quickly as possible. That's
really great. That's great. Do you know anything about these languages in the school system in Canada? I'm currently working near Toronto, says Tessa Troughton. And thanks, this has been so interesting. So do you know anything about the languages being used in the school systems in Canada? Anything near Toronto?
Thank you for that question. So I'm not very sure about Canada, but I do have contacts that I can communicate. I put you in communication with who work with Indigenous communities in Canada. So please email me.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, I would like to hear your thoughts of recent Indigenous arrivals who had interrupted schooling or no schooling, and then they are placed in a bilingual classroom, hence learning the two languages, as you said, the Spanish and the English simultaneously. What are your thoughts on that, Luis?
Yes, that's a deep conversation, deeper conversation than 1 minute answer. But let me tell you this, I think those students, teachers, teacher education programs and teachers, and I'm not putting the responsibility on the teachers, I'm putting the responsibility on the school districts, the administration, because I feel like teachers, everybody's always like, teachers need to do this, teachers need to do that. Okay, what resources are you giving teachers? You know, so I put this responsibility on the school districts and the administrators. It's very, very important that we are aware that this population of Indigenous migrant students that we're receiving are migrant students who come with traumatic events because they were, their education was interrupted once they arrive here. And many, we do have a list of names, sadly, of Indigenous children who died when they were in this, in custody at the US border. So these students are going to come with social emotional needs that, in my view, are perhaps a little bit deeper than the prior populations that we have. And I feel personally, that if we don't take care of that first, teaching is going to be a little bit challenging for them, in addition to interrupted education. So we should take care of social emotional well-being in simultaneously or before we focus on literacy for this particular student population. That's just in my view.
Next question says, thanks for a great presentation, Luis. I'd be interested to hear more about how we can reposition Indigenous students as resource for their school communities. So how can other students gain cultural awareness through their interactions with Indigenous migrant students?
Thank you for this question. I realized I didn't answer the bilingual education. I'll circle back to that now. But for resources, thank you so much for this question. Something that I continuously try to do in my school district, it didn't work. We need more voices. We need more visibility. The Indigenous communities, many times, when we have Indigenous students, they have communities, Indigenous communities there in the community. So if we have an Ichil student, chances are in that school or in that community, there are going to be more Ichil people, more in Ichil language speakers and communities in that region, in that place, because they usually migrate and become part of the community in the US. So you have community of Ichil speakers, like in Manassas, for example, a large population of Ichil speakers. And I always try to tell my school district, look, these are trilingual people that we have here. Why can we hire them as resource for our schools? And I'm not talking about students, I'm talking about parents, I'm talking about Indigenous adults who are trilingual, who can work in the school system and are finding a difficult time finding work. So why can we hire them and start using them as a resource? They have so much knowledge that they can bring, English, Spanish, and their Indigenous language. And then that's something that I continuously try to do in my school district, to use them as resource. And then once we have that representation, that visibility in school with parents, with people from in the Indigenous community in our schools, then students will start using their languages, their cultures, and then they'll become more visible and they'll start using, we can use those, that culture, that language as a resource. For example, in Manassas, they do every year before COVID, they did like festivals and things to celebrate their Mayan culture, the Mayan language, the Mayan heritage. Those are things that we need, but we need representation first in schools with adults who are Indigenous. That's something that we're lacking. And we only have 1 minute left.
We have 1 minute left, and we have many more questions that we won't be able to answer. So this is being recorded and you will have access. You can see Luis's email here, so please reach out to him with unanswered questions. The last one is, I love the examples of poetry you had in the presentation. I think this alone would create a sense of wonder in a classroom. What other
Yes.
strategies do you use or learn to create to help students create a more culturally, linguistically appreciative environment for all members of the class?
Social emotional learning, and please email me. I'll be glad to share a PowerPoint that I'm working on for Friday. I have another presentation. I'll be glad to share it with you. So I have some information there about poetry and social emotional learning.
Okay, great. And that concludes today's webinar with Dr. Luis Javier Penton Herrera. Thank you very much for joining us on behalf of TESOL International and the Intercultural Communication Interest Section. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And you have my email there. Thank you for joining me. It was truly a pleasure. Thank you.